like to call upon the Prime Minister of Heaven to direct the first.
Thank you, of course, Mr. Speaker, for recognizing me, members of this panel for coming out and judging, Hopkins for running a great tournament, everybody for coming out and watching this round, good friends on side opposition for interest in being spirited debate, Max for a great speech to come. The resolution before this House is that this House believes fanaticism, is a force of good. In particular, we believe that religious fanaticism in the United States has been a force of good, and we believe that the Christian right has been good for, on balance, the Christian right has been good for American democracy. This is normally the time that we run cases about the ACLU and how much we love liberals, but we thought we'd give it a little spice. Any questions? Did what you were on. Go ahead.
What the hell does that mean?
On balance, we think that the Christian right has been good for American democracy. I mean, Pat seems to know what he's going to do with it, so we'll let Pat take care of this one, Phil. First point we'd like to talk about is media spotlighting, because one of the things that we think the Christian right does that really helps American democracy is it adds a layer of transparency to the democratic system, which we believe is fundamentally good. The Christian right certainly has its own agenda in American politics, and they advocate a lot of things that I don't support, and, given that I'm in a room full of apta debaters, I imagine most people don't support the Christian right in this room. But we think that the Christian right does do a lot of things that benefit all of us. One of the things they do is have well-funded media campaigns. They seek out information about public officials. They tell us what our public officials are doing. And regardless of whether or not we think that the issues that they spotlight are important issues, it is important that they tell us about the behavior of public officials so that individuals in a democracy can determine whether or not they think the public official is doing this. All right, Matt.
Evan, if the political pack of, human cannibalism ran a lot of media ads, despite the fact that they had lots of media ads promoting cannibalism, we still wouldn't say that's a good political party.
Right. But what is the Christian right's agenda in large part? One of the things... Okay. But one of the things that you and I may think is crazy is that they support public officials who they believe behave morally in their private lives. This is something that I think is ridiculous, that we should hold people accountable for their sex lives. But this is a democracy, and there are plenty of people who think that public officials should behave morally in their private lives. And it's up to everybody else to go around deciding what they think is important in the role of a public official. I don't get to decide what everybody else should think is important. The religious right adds a layer of transparency, spotlights a lot of issues that many people do believe are important. We're in the minority in this room, insofar as we're a bunch of liberal elites who are well-educated and believe a lot of things that the rest of the country doesn't believe. The rest of the country thinks a lot of issues are important that the majority of the people in this room don't think are important. The religious right gives them information that they don't get through a lot of other media sources. All right.
Isn't it a fact, though, that the religious right is actually a very small but vocal group within the Republican Party? And anything, they hijack the GOP's interests?
Okay, but in a lot of cases, you see the religious right advocating an agenda that doesn't reflect the opinions of a lot of Christians. That is, I think Jerry Falwell and the like are a lot more conservative and homophobic than most Christians in the country. Nonetheless, many people do believe that morality and a lot of the things that the Christian Coalition and similar groups highlight are important issues. They do that. It helps American democracy. The next idea that I want to talk about is a debate about the proper role of government, because I think the Christian right brings a very unique philosophy to the table. They want the government to engage in policies that advocate moral issues, that say people should be taught things in classrooms about how to behave morally, people should be taught in certain ways, the government should behave in certain ways that you and I may not want the government to behave in. What we think on this side of the House is that it is important for the government to engage in moral behavior, to teach people to behave morally, and to have morally consistent, philosophically proper policies. We believe that the Christian right engages in a debate about what philosophically proper policies are, underlying philosophical questions about what government should be and what government should do. I tend to err on the side of the ACLU, but the Christian Coalition provides the counterbalance to that way. Last one.
Our system is based on a kind of secular morality, and we say that values should come from secularism, whereas the Christian right denies that and says because it's handed down by God, we shouldn't be doing this analysis. It rejects the secular framework, which is the basis of our society.
When was our society based on secular morality? I didn't catch that. I mean, the entire foundation of our legal system is a very religious one. We've got... Read any legal document that was important in the founding of this country. I've got coins in my pockets. They seem to have "In God We Trust" all over them. I mean, it's a national model. We do rely on a moral framework that is Judeo-Christian in nature. So, no, we're not a secular society, but more importantly, many people believe things that are based on religious tenets. I think that it's important that you debate the proper role of government, even if you don't think the Christian right is right about the proper role of government. We also think on this side of the House that the Christian right provides a unique the Christian right uniquely unifies the left in the United States. That is, in a lot of European countries, in addition to just having representative government, you also see left, opposition parties that are very divided because there isn't something that they all oppose. Lots and lots and lots of people oppose the Christian right. And so you see the unification of the left against a lot of these things. You see a discourse that is being elevated because lots of people are becoming involved in it. And that's the last thing that I want to talk about, voting and participation in government. Because religious zealots vote. Like nobody else, if people are out there protesting abortion, they've got the big signs with, the little fetuses on them, you can bet that guy's going to the polls in November. We think that a lot of religious zealots get out to the polls, and because people fear religious zealots getting out to the polls and co-opting their government, a lot of other people get out to the polls, like me and Matt, who don't think that these people ought to be controlling our government. I think that by elevating this level of debate, by getting people interested in politics again, they've increased participation in our government, they've increased the amount of attention that people pay to political issues and to policy issues. I think that a lot of people pay attention to politics and just the game of politics when it comes to policy issues that they don't understand. But when it comes to moral debates, people become engaged in political discourse. We think that's a good thing for a healthy democracy. What we believe on this side of the House is that checks exist against the religious right, that they're never going to co-opt the American government and have their way with everybody getting taught the Bible in elementary school and having, evolution being thrown out of American classrooms. We think there are enough liberal checks on these kind of extreme policies. What we think on this side of the House, though, is that they've done a lot to elevate the level of discourse in American politics. They've done a lot to check leftist policies, and they've done a lot to elevate the discourse about what the proper role of government is, something that hasn't been debated without the Christian right's input, something that probably wouldn't be debated without the Christian right. And I think that most of the people in this room agree people should be talking about what the proper role of government is. I'm proud to talk.
I thank Evan for his eloquent remarks. I forgot to say earlier that there's going to be a floor vote worth 10, and there's a judging panel of 11. That said, I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition, Pat Nichols, to deliver an 8-minute speech.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, Bill, for being a first-rate partner this weekend, our opponents for a case, which I will delight in discussing, and of course, everyone here assembled in the Hopkins team for an awesome tournament. I have a confession to make. I'm a Republican. But the reason I frame myself as a libertarian is because I hate the Republican right with a passion. I actually, every morning when I wake up, I just long for the death of hardcore conservative net jobs that hijack this country. And I'm sure many people in this room also long for these people's deaths. And so the proposition that I'm proud to defend in this side of the House is that this is a group of people who have a bad framework and a bad conception of what it is that government should do, that they hijack the interests, and I think interests of Americans in general and of the Republican Party in particular, and that they basically, the GOP is essentially thrust into a very negative position insofar as rights in general of individuals in society are restricted by the policies advocated by the religious right, and it's those things I'm going to talk about in this round. The first thing I want to talk about is the disproportionate influence that we believe the Republican right has on general policy crafted by the Republican National Party. The thing is something that's important to realize, right? We're talking about basically a very small group of well-organized people who are pretty well-funded. And what ultimately happens is that small group of people, I think, disproportionately affects a lot of the policies that basically Republicans have to represent and stand for. The fact that the American president, right now, is afraid to talk about abortion and afraid to admit that abortion is probably morally okay, shouldn't be taken down, most Republicans are afraid to admit those kinds of things in public, even though they actually believe them, is because of the Republican right. It's because of groups that hold deeply held convictions that really are counter to most of the views held by Americans, yet the major political party, one of the two biggest in the country, the one that happens to control all politics, is essentially hijacked by a small number of people's interests. It doesn't sound like democracy if one small core group basically controls the way half of the political agenda is set.
What you just said is that most people are pro-choice and the president is afraid to advocate a pro-life stance. what's the problem here? Where's the
No,
effect?
I think you misunderstood, right? I said that the president is afraid to advocate a pro-choice stance, right? Because of the Republican right, because of politics like that. I'm sure there are numerous times, like in every state where it's a majority Republican state, basically because a lot of the money to run political campaigns ends up coming from the Republican right and guys like that. Essentially, a moderate Republican senator who might craft policy, which more people would agree with, no thank you, is afraid to come out and stand for those kinds of positions. Simply because a small group of Bible-pounding nuts feel one way about an issue, and we think that's bad. Ultimately, I think a democracy isn't benefited by one small pack, one small political interest, essentially setting the legislative agenda. We think that's a bad thing, and we're proud to stand for, I think, a more inclusive government. So if the Republican right didn't exist, that wouldn't happen. No thank you. The second thing I want to talk about, though, is the essential nature of the Republican right. Because it's not just a bunch of guys who have conservative views. It's a bunch of guys who have conservative views that come from a firm belief in religion and a firm grounding in religion. And I think that's different and very bad. When these guys get up here and say that, well, really, America isn't a secular country because, the word God is on a quarter, that just means that, America isn't a secular nation. That's wrong. Understand that, one of the founding principles of our government is the notion of separation of state and church, right? And insofar as the Republican right is a politically motivated group that's motivated primarily by their religious views, I think that's bad too. Because if you value, the Establishment Clause, right? If you value the notion that, the government should have no business in promoting religious values, the government should have no business in promoting a specific religion, and it's not like the Republican right are well, we think Judaism's okay too, and we love those Muslims. These are nut jobs who are only Christians. Insofar as these people have a specific religious agenda, I think that's bad too. But defend that, sir.
But don't you think our founding fathers thought that our certain inalienable rights were endowed by our Creator?
All right.
How is it secular?
Just okay. Whoa. Because the word God is in quarters, and because Congress prays before session starts, it does not mean that it's all right to force people to pray in school. That's the plus case. No, thank you. Understand that all kinds of policies that we all agree on. If they had run any of these policies, we call them tight cases. Charitable choice is bad. It's bad to force people to pray in schools. Those are all obviously terrible things that are agendas essentially and political moves promoted by the Republican right. I think those are all bad things. Insofar as all the views of the Republican right issued strictly from a belief in God, that's bad. Moreover, when they talk about moral discourse, this is another thing I want to nail home. If you think of morality and all of your views are dictated by God and by a book written 2,000 years ago, guess what? That makes political compromise and actual disagreement and analysis of issues a lot tougher when someone says, my God said this is where morality comes from, and no other discussion and discourse is possible. The third thing I want to talk about, though, is the proper view of government. No, thank you, because what we want to defend on our side of the house is essentially the view that the proper role of the state isn't to tell people, isn't to dictate to people how to live their own lives, right? I think a deeply held liberal conviction that many people tend to believe simply that we live our lives, right? And it's the role of government to provide some kind of framework such that people don't go around violating other people's rights all the time. But so long as they make self-regarding decisions without some kind of overwhelming negative societal implication, they should be probably free to make those kinds of decisions for themselves. Autonomy is the thing we value in our side of the house. Now, what are the actual views promoted by the Republican right? No, thank you. The view essentially is that it's really the proper role of the state is to dictate to people how to best live their lives, right? I'd like to talk about a lot of examples of things and policies the Republican right has managed to actually hijack the political arena and cause that. One example is the fact that homosexuals in this country have virtually none of the rights that non-homosexuals have, and that's a humongous issue. Now, where does that come from? It essentially comes from not the fact that most people hate gays. It's the fact that the Republican right thinks that homosexuality is something prescribed and immoral, coming down from God. That's a pretty terrible thing. It's gay people can't get married. It means that gay people can't adopt. It means that Ashcroft, right, our current Attorney General, actually vetoed when he was the governor of his state, actually vetoed more government funding for AIDS, to do AIDS research. And the reason he gave is he thought it'd make the book soft on homosexuality. These are all terrible kinds of policies that issue from those deeply held religious beliefs. No, thank you. We don't think a rational person would have. In fact, abortion policy is another one, right? That's almost strictly a self-regarding choice. And the fact that the Republican right thinks that it's the proper role of government to tell people how to dictate their own internal affairs is a pretty wretched thing. All right, shoot.
When I wasn't looking, did we suddenly let teachers start leading prayers in schools, and did we criminalize abortion? Because it doesn't seem to me that these things are illegal.
Every time one of those cases hits the Supreme Court, and that happens all the time, usually they're years and years before they actually hit the Supreme Court. And you better believe that in places in Texas right now, there are violations of the Establishment Clause that happen all of the time. Moreover, even if it doesn't happen all the time, right? It's bad for a group, I think, to be advocating, and if they had sufficient political power, potentially changing the Constitution or forcing policies that we think the government shouldn't be making and deciding in the first place. On the case, the first thing to say is that media focus is good. Well, I think, I want you to imagine there's the Satan worshiper pack in America, right? And these group of people advocated any number of horrible things, torturing babies to death, whatever, right? Now, because that group existed, because they went around like snooping into people's private lives and like promoting politically all kinds of insane views, one would say that, well, because those guys run ads on television, they're a great like force in society. Like, that'd be crazy. Now, understand that the point about media focus, I think, is irrelevant. Look, you have to believe that the policies promoted by the Republican right are of value to think that the media focus they put on those issues is of value, right? I don't think they've actually shown that at all. They say promoting moral accountability. Look, like the fact that there have been numerous investigations of like the internal affairs of people's lives and like their privacy is violated, I don't think that's a good thing either. I don't think it's good that like these are a bunch of guys who wasted like tons of government resources and basically destroyed individuals' privacy for the sake of like their own random moral crusades. See that most Americans hold these kinds of views. That's not it at all, right? I would argue that the Republican right is actually a pretty small subset of most Republicans and most conservatives. Most people like don't like this party. Many Republicans feel like the Republican Party's interests have been hijacked by this minority. They say like it's good to have morality. Look, understand that like it's not like Democrats are a bunch of immoral bastards, right? Like they just say, oh, because we don't like Bibles, like we don't believe that there's a right and wrong way to conduct yourself. Moreover, think about the source of the morality, right? At the point you say like, well, I think morality issues from God because it was written down in a book 2,000 years ago, I don't think that actually allows for any kind of critique of moral views. The second point then says, look, this unifies the left, right? I guess this is Evan's way of saying, really guys, I'm a Democrat. And so it's good because it gives the Democrats more power. Understand that first of all, the left is divided, right? And there's no equivalent group in the Democratic Party that has the same kind of sway and power that I think the Republican right does. And the fact of the matter is that you have this small minority that think unbalances things. It's not like the Democratic Party is like this unified front to conservatism. Take a look at what happened in the last cycle of elections if you doubt me on that, right? And so I think it's bad that there's this like one block of nut jobs who essentially hijack their political interest. There's no equivalent group to balance them out on the left. The final thing to say is, look, it's good to get people to vote. Like, if there's a serious threat of like the Nazi Party taking over America tomorrow, right? People would probably go up to the ballot box. They'd be afraid of like the Nazis running our frickin' government. That doesn't mean it's good to have the Nazi Party as a viable political force in America. First of all, like for those checks, like constitutional checks, like there's a long waiting process. People's rights are violated in the meantime. There are all kinds of things the Republican right pushes that are outside the scope of the Constitution, which we think are still bad. And even if they got enough power, they could amend the Constitution. All reasons why the Republican right has been a bad force in America and should be, normatively gone. For all these reasons, we are proud of it.
I thank Pat for his impassioned remarks. We call upon Max to give the member of government speech here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to everyone here. This has been a fantastic week, and I'm very happy to be here. As Evan did, since we're defending the Christian right, I'm going to give a shout out to God, thank him for making all this possible. Great friends inside opposition. I think this has been a great op, though I think misguided so far in terms of all around. I'd like to give an independent area of analysis to discuss my main interest in running this case, Evan's main interest in running this case, and why it hasn't really been hit yet. We ran a case to say that the Christian right has been good for American democracy, not would it be cool if the Christian right got elected and ran everything for us? Like, we're not crazy. This Tight-Link resolution that was proposed had to do with fanaticism. No one in the right mind is going to run the case. It would be cool if fanatics ran the show. It's that fanatics involved in the system, allowed to express their views, benefit the entire discourse, benefit democracy. And I'll tell you why. First off, for all of the reasons you heard from Evan. But I'll give you another good one, a more philosophical one. John Stuart Mill, when he constructs, like every philosopher who ever wrote, feels the need to do so. He wrote about a dialectic in some shape or another, but he talks about utility coming from letting everyone speak. Everyone, speak out of their voices. Because, in particular, if you let everything play out over time, the most true value is the one that prevails, because you can disprove the false ones. You can get closer and closer to better and more true realities. If we allow everyone to speak, if we don't give them the fodder of saying, you don't belong in our political dialogue, you as the Christian right are just too crazy, we're going to outlaw you, that gives them fodder. That says, yes, this is tyrannical. If we say, hey, Timothy McVeigh, we're going to execute you, then anyone who's sort of on the fence, people way out there and kind of crazy think, wow, he's right, the government does kill people, the government does not care about our liberty, and that's cannon fodder. That's not what we want to do. American democracy is about progress. American democracy is about questioning the rules of government and over time getting to a better role of government, something Pat didn't really address. But I want to deal with what Pat does address, because he begins, he says at the beginning of the speech something very ambitious that he doesn't follow through with. He says he's going to show you that the existence of the Christian right is going to provide a bad framework. They have bad interests. It's going to hijack everything. It's hijacked the GOP and it destroys everything. He hasn't demonstrated that. But, we'll go through, he hasn't demonstrated any of it. But I'll show you why point by point. The first thing he tells you is that there's disproportionate influence. It affects policy. he says all this stuff about how there's this big effect because now you can't have an abortion, and now, all these things that are really unpopular are the law. The last I checked, most Americans are pro-choice. Abortion is still legal. The last I checked, most Americans are not in favor of prayer in schools. You can't pray in schools. Last I checked, there's a growing, in fact, I think the best example that Pat talks about is the gay rights movement, because what he talks to you about is, he says, these guys hate gays, they're stopping, homosexuals, they stop the progress of gay rights movements. On the contrary, with the rise of the Christian Coalition in the last 20 years in particular, this is the first time in history when you've unified the left around anti-Christian rights stuff and up, so you start to have civil union laws in various states because people say, what the hell? This is crazy backward stuff that homosexuals don't have rights. You have to, it ties the arcane holdovers from when everyone was religious into, I'll get in a second, it ties the holdovers that we don't consciously think of as religiously motivated to actual religion by saying this is something religious people believe, and it's difficult, you can't justify this in any non-religious way. And that is the level at which you have progress. That is the time when you say a liberal cannot support this. Most thinking conservatives cannot support this, and at that point, then you have progress, sure.
You're honestly saying that basically the reason why the homosexual community was able to get rights is because there were people who were so strongly saying homosexuals shouldn't have rights.
Oh, that's crazy, because we've never had anything reactive, and we've never had any progress through reaction. Look at history. Come on, Phil. I know that you're Canadian, but in the American, in American history, we have this, Third Amendment, which no one knows about how you're not allowed, the U.S. government can't take over a person's house and, can't put their stuff there. That's not like an inalienable right, and it's a priori important. That's just because the British people did that, so we reacted to it, and it becomes an important right. But, that's how progress happens, reaction. If you, people who saw The Fifth Element, you remember that guy, Zorg, when he, breaks the thing, and he says, if you break something, then you have all these people who have jobs to fix it? That's how progress happens. That's the only way it happens. All right. The 5 people who saw The Fifth Element actually got that. Additionally, the influence is limited because people are interested in re-election. You don't win re-election without having people vote for you, period. The next thing that Pat talks to you about is the nature of the religious right. And he says, our society has always been secular, it's secular motivated, blah, blah, blah. If it was truly secular, we wouldn't have said in the Declaration of Independence that the origin of the rights that we enjoy is that our Creator gave them to us. The most basic thing about liberal democracy is rights. And the way our government institutionalizes rights is based on the assumption that we are endowed by our Creator. This is not to advocate a religious position. This is to say that it's ludicrous to exclude it entirely from the domain of discourse. We don't actually exclude the American Nazi Party or the American Communist Party or anything like that. Those parties are legal. This is not and that's clearly a little more crazy than this. It's not just quarters. It's everywhere. And again, if they won, things would be crazy. I'm not a Christian conservative, but that little, breaking the glass and allowing people to have jobs is progress. The last thing Pat tells you off case is that lives shouldn't be dictated by government. He gives you that example of homosexuals that I said earlier. And we know that because we're thinking about it. And the reason we're thinking about it is because we're on a debate circuit where a lot of people think, maybe I want to come up with this philosophical or political notion of this. And that is a trend that is growing because people are dissatisfied with these easy religious answers. People want to come up with a sophisticated secular notion of rights. People want to come up with some sort of philosophies that are independent of religion. That's not just on APTA, that's in academia. That's everywhere. That exists because this is, if nothing else, think of the Fifth Element analogy here. This is huge. This is something that benefits people over time. No thanks. I said no thanks. The Christian right, again, is only a few decades old, and in these last few decades we've seen some of the most progress for liberal causes. I want to go case study. The first thing Evan talks to you about is media spotlights. He talks to you about
Zorg?
Yeah, Zorg.
Didn't he try to destroy the universe?
Yes. But Jerry Falwell has not, right? Jerry Falwell has no military, Okay. Can't do it. He also doesn't have that really cool hat or the weird haircut. So media spotlighting. I really wish more of you had seen that movie. It's really good. The well-funded media campaigns that he talks about that investigate people, we see as intrinsically valuable. Not that it actually brings valuable information to the discourse, but that it provides a transparency that is itself an intrinsic good. That people are looking at government. That people are interested in what's going on with their leaders. That people are no longer just, we'll let someone else vote and figure out who's leading my country and dictating things that are important to my lives. This is something that's valuable. People have questions, and these people, and the Christian coalition is interested to spend the money to find out what the answers to those questions are, we think that's valuable to the discourse, even if the facts that they find out are moronic, period. The next thing Evan titles the second point proper rule of government, and there's other stuff there too, but Pat drops the underlying point. He doesn't talk to you about a competing notion of the proper rule of government that excludes discourse, that excludes progress through open discourse, through open dialogue, and he doesn't give you anything like that. We talk to you about how there are underlying philosophical concerns governing every policy that need to be examined. And Pat here just simply focuses on the rather the sub-point about uniquely unifying the left and leaving the right a little bit more divided because of this. On that side, they just say the Dems are still divided. I don't think that's an adequate response on face. They'd be more divided. The last thing that we talk to you about is voting and participation. Both zealots vote, and people who hate zealots, like us, vote a lot. It increases the number of all the checks that exist to prevent things from getting too crazy, from Zorg winning or from Jerry Falwell taking things over successfully. So it would be bad if they're powerful, but if they're not, as long as they're not powerful, as long as they're just around, they are strictly beneficial to our society, and I'm very proud to propose.
I thank Max and call on Phil for the last constructive speech of the day.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, of course, to Side Government for an interesting case. Thank you, of course, to Patrick for an excellent speech, another one to come. Thank you, of course, to the Hopkins teams for what's been a fantastic tournament. Worth coming all the way down here for 8 hours. I'm sure everyone agrees. And thank you to everyone for sticking around. Patrick and I are not saying and not defending the case that we should ban the Christian rights freedom of speech. We think that everyone in society should have a right to freedom of speech. We think that Nazis should have a right to freedom of speech. We think that hate-mongering KKK members should have a freedom of speech. That's one question as to whether they should have the freedom of speech. What this case is about is whether an analysis of the freedom of speech which they have is a net positive benefit to the democratic process. We say unambiguously, it's precisely because they have a disproportionate influence in terms of how that freedom of speech affects society, which is why it's not a good face on, in terms of the democratic process. So let me give you 7 reasons as to why they have a disproportionate influence which is not good for society. The first one is the primary process. And Patrick brought this up in his own speech, but I want to flesh it out. A Republican candidate has no chance in hell of being elected as the Republican candidate unless he gives in on the issues that he knows can galvanize people in the Bible Belt, which is so important for the most important climate. The second thing is that what happens with these religious rights is that there's a huge amount of votes for a few small issues which cloud out other issues, which mean that those issues don't get the proportional democratic representation proportional to the impact they actually have aggregately on society. So, for example, at the point where people can get galvanized about abortion, Israel, homosexuals, and sodomy laws, other more important laws, which in a utilitarian sense would have a bigger democratic influence, don't get as much attention. The third reason is monetary contributions, which is huge. Like a lot of people in Texas who happen to have lots of oil money are also part of the Christian right. They're mainly the people who funded George both through his governor's race and through his election race. And it's also a lot of the people who are Floridians who happen to give the political impetus for what was eventually Bush v. Gore. But the fourth thing I want to talk about is that it's bad to have a system which ties your political beliefs to what your preacher says. What we would say is that, like, political discourse, how society is run, should be different than your particular religious faith. And what happens in this particular case is that the person who's telling you how to vote isn't the political debate, isn't the person who's like an economist or some sort of social worker. It's your preacher who is simply telling you this is the way you should vote, and people vote listening to their preacher, who we would say doesn't really know the issues as to what's best for society and the democratic process. So that's number 4. Number 5 is Supreme Court appointments. The point here is that, well, abortion is safe forever. Bullshit. Supreme Court appointments are coming up, and one of the main things that the Republicans know, the Democrats know, is that there's going to be a huge amount of sway on this one small issue that they might say, okay, objectively, this person's a much better Supreme Court justice, I'll take you in a second, but because I know that I'll get huge political condemnation if I appoint this much more qualified judge who will uphold Roe versus Wade, I'm going to appoint this less qualified judge who will not support Roe versus Wade.
Yeah, but didn't Karl Rove say, like many times publicly, that sacrificing all the progress the Republican Party has made by... Oh, come on, you had 7 points. I can ask you a question. Shut up. That sacrificing it for abortion is going to be the death of the party because then people won't vote for them. They'll view them as extreme. Isn't the check of democracy?
Sorry, but at the point where George Bush knows, or whatever Republican candidate knows, that if they don't support the guy who's against abortion, they're going to have huge political ramifications. I don't care what this lying bastard happens to say. Sorry, I hate Karl Rove. He's the devil himself. But the 6th thing is media influence, and here's where I want to talk about it. I'm in Boston, all right? some guy appears on public access continuously called the Tom Hagee Ministries. He has a series called Islam and America, which says, contrary to what we've been trying to say throughout the democratic process, contrary to what Bush himself has been saying, that Islam and the West are incompatible. What we would say is that this disproportionate amount of media influence, which goes all across the nation, is very bad for the democratic process, hinders relationship between Islam and the West, which is a better thing to do. There's all sorts of other examples. But number 7, the last one, is foreign policy. If you guys watch 60 Minutes, you might have seen a special which basically shows that the biggest supporters of Israel in the United States are not actually Jews, they're actually the Christian right. This amount of influence not only subverts the American democratic process, also subverts foreign policy in other countries. Like, one of the reasons why there's so much support is that the Christian right actually believes that when the apocalypse comes, it's really important that Jews be in Israel. Now, it's kind of ironic that the Christian right expects the Jews to die at the Armageddon, but the point is that foreign policy is also... But okay, what are their responses? They're like, well, Mill says that it's good to get those views out there. We agree. Mill would not have said that it's good to have the most extremist view sort of overcrowd the whole thing. But then we get the most interesting argument of the round, which is that homosexuals owe their rights to the Christian right. Okay, well, woo. Because they're saying that, like, homosexual, it didn't occur to them that they should have rights before someone said, you guys are the worst sacks of crap in the world. Like, this is just ridiculous. People advocated for their rights and were upheld for a long time. That's why sodomy laws were staying for such a long time, because of the Christian right. Well, let me just extend this, right? According to their analysis, they're like, blacks owe rights to the KKK, Jews owe the right to their Nazis, and Canadian attorneys owe their rights to South Park, pretty much. The second point which I want to bring up is the nature of the Republican Party. And here's where I really want to talk about what this country was founded on, apparently, is what I've been told. Essentially, this country is founded on the fact that the nature of why we want to have separation in church and religion isn't just on paper. It's the fact that we don't want to have religion dictating what the policies of this state are. Now, even if there's not an explicit policy, I'd say that if our foreign policy, if our domestic policy is disproportionately influenced by religion, we're going against that principle. They say, well, we have in God we trust on our penny. We do because exactly what we're talking about. There is a disproportionate amount of influence. That's why things have been said. Like the reason why we had to have and talk about the fact that there shouldn't be the Ten Commandments in school because it was against the democratic process, against individual rights for like Muslim kids to be taught this kind of thing, was precisely because of the religious right. But the third thing which Patrick talks about is proper rule of government. I think that this is particularly important. All we have to do to win this round is to have you ask yourselves the question, is democracy in the sense that every person should have the equal amount of political power, better served or worse served by having this one particular group, which happens to have a disproportionate amount of influence for the 7 examples which I talked about? Let's get back to case. The first thing they talk about is media spotlight. Okay. And they say that it's actually good that the Christian right is there to bring forward those extremist views, which is good. What I want to offer is an alternate view of freedom of speech as to what the net impact actually is. See, one of the things about freedom of speech is that there can be an irony to freedom of speech, which is what we would consider when it comes to political finance and things like that. The point is that if I'm sitting here, and there are 5 other guys, and I happen to have the same amount of freedom of speech as these guys, but these guys all have bullhorns, essentially the point is that when they have the resources to exploit their freedom of speech so much more than me, the net effect is that I don't have as much freedom of speech, and my views aren't going to be represented. But see, like, they might talk about this on a rights issue, but on a democratic issue, democracy is precisely supposed to be that each individual is supposed to have the same amount of influence. So by definition, the fact that the Christian right, like the average Christian in the United States, has a lot more influence than the average black in the United States, we would say that that's against democracy. But another thing which we would say is that, like, it might be good to have these views out there if they're actually representative of the vote. What we would say is that they're not really representative of the vote. They're actually representative of a disproportionately small minority, which happens to have a large amount of influence for all the reasons I talked about. They say you want to get others' perspectives out there against abortion and sexual explicitness. What we would say is that, yes, you are popping up these things, but what you don't see is that you're actually taking away influence from other issues which we happen to think, in the larger framework, are democratically more important. Like, they only quote you a very small number of issues. But I would tell you all the issues that the church doesn't focus on, which would be focused on more if politicians knew that if they focused on those issues, those were the real issues, and then we could have a larger debate. The second thing he talks about is that he unifies the left. Well, Patrick says that there are no communists. But, like, look, do you think the communists were like, well, it's good to have the fascists because now at least we know who to hate? This is a ridiculous point. Like, the left, if you ask them, isn't happy to have the Christian right. Like, they're saying in an abstract metaphysical sense they're happy that they're there. But furthermore, I don't see what unification has happened. Like, all of a sudden John Kerry and, like, Joe Lieberman are going to say, you know, we disagree on everything, but now we're good friends because we hate the Christian right. Like, I don't think they've explained the mechanism which goes forward. But let me go to the last thing, which is voting and participation in government. Here's what's particularly important. See, the thing is that one of the things about the Christian coalition is that they have enough political power to actually get a candidate which represents their interests. One of the things is that blacks don't come up to vote because they don't have enough political power to actually get a candidate which represents their interests. So at the point where they not only go up to vote, but actually tailor candidates specifically to their interests, what happens is that they get a disproportionate disproportional amount of voting compared to the people who don't have enough political power. So we think that it's bad that these people do come out to vote in droves when other people who don't have all this influence can't get their views represented. Mr. Speaker, we are show of hands.
I thank Phil and recall Pat to deliver the Leader of Opposition rebuttal. Oh, sorry, wait, more speeches. Let's take a government. Go with
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thanks, everyone. Great tournament. Really loved it. It was hungover 2 days in a row. With that said, I think there's one person that no one in this round has talked about, and I can't believe his name hasn't come up. And that person's name is Jerry Falwell. I mean, how can we talk about the Christian right for this long without bringing up the man's name? Let's talk about a few of the things that Jerry Falwell has said publicly. And the first thing he came up and said, he said that the Antichrist is on Earth right now, and he's a Jewish man between the age of 18 and 25. Personally, considering the makeup of Apter right now, I'm guessing the Antichrist is in this room. And with that said, he's a lot of other things. He's also come out and he said, that a Minute Maid commercial that showed Pluto and Popeye hugging is, pro-gay and should be banned from TV. He said Tinky Winky is a role model for gay people. This makes Jerry Falwell look like a very bad person. But you know what he does? He represents the dark part of a lot of people's minds. And by him going out and making this public discourse, he's bringing out a discourse between the hearts of people and the minds of people. We get a Hegelian dialectic between both sides of these. And by him coming out, and by the Republican right making this public discourse, what we do is we change things. And we get people to affirm their beliefs and improve their society. Jerry Falwell, when he went publicly out against gays, he's actually okay living with gay people now. Actually, one of his best friends is gay. I don't know if you know this. It's his next-door neighbor at his church in Virginia. Why? Because this man made it a point to go out and show Jerry that gays are nice people too. We can see how Jerry Falwell's public discourse has changed America, has changed the way they think, and has changed the way they feel about democracy. That's something they have on their side of the house. They have more intelligent voters. They don't have that on their side of the house. But I want to bring up someone else that maybe you don't know, and that person is Denise's mom. Denise's mom is crazy. For 18 years, she has been writing a poem and putting to music a song that is the point of view of the fetus to the mother about abortion. She recently got it copyrighted. The lines begin let the bonds begin or something like that. She's made Denise climb 100 steps on her knees to go up to the second most important Catholic shrine in Canada. This is what this woman is. But you know what she is? She's an example of Monrovian democracy in the United States. Because she is an example of what can happen when a grassroots movement succeeds. If you think about it, what has the Christian right done? They don't have a lot of money individually. It's a lot of people who are actually lower and lower middle class. But what they've done is they've banded together as a special interest group in order to further their needs, in order to further their ideas. They serve as an example to the rest of the nation of how to succeed in bringing forth an issue and discussing this. This is something that every other group can look to as a model, and that no other group has really succeeded in doing. I think when you look at the point of what America was founded on what James Monroe did when he helped write the Constitution, then we see all the positive that they show as an example and as a furtherer of discourse. And it's for that reason that I really feel Gov has brought up all the best points in this round. I like Gov.
Right here.
Go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the August House on both sides for throwing out an interesting case. I really want to talk about an interesting, what on earth does government think they're saying here? They're saying it is best that we place this group that is opposed to free discourse in a position that they can talk because free discourse is good. They say all of these benefits, having people talk to each other is something we want. And then they go and say that a group that has throughout history been one of the most oppressive and racist groups within America are going to be good for this type of process. These are the people who are trying to destroy the principles that this process is based upon. Because look at what the religious right has promoted. They're anti-homosexual. They're racist. They want to start war with the Islam and Muslim world instead of having free discourse. This is the type of thing that's antithetical to democracy. This is the type of thing that is antithetical to what our country, I think, should be. Because you look at the past. I think a lot of what we've seen in the future and through modern progress is movement away from this type of religious fanaticism. The people who founded this country were the religious right in that time, and they didn't let black people vote. They denied women's suffrage. They wanted to limit the people's power solely to people who had land in this country. These are not the types of things that promote a democratic process. And if they acknowledge on their side that a democratic process is good, then already opposition wins. And then you simply find the point that throughout history, we've just seen people learning, people who actually have rational and secular morals, teaching the religious right that they're wrong. That's when we've seen equity within this country. That's when we've seen progress. It's when the people who are trying to stamp down upon this and censor people have lost power. So how on earth have they done good to the process? I don't believe government's right.
Nobody? All right. Then I now do in fact call upon Pat.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, members of this most august House, Phil for his excellent speech, and of course the Hopkins team for putting together the best Northams ever.
Here, here.
I guess the issue in this round, right, is whether or not the existence of a very powerful, very driven, pretty insane PAC, right, a political interest group that has one narrow view that issues from their religious beliefs is good for the democratic process. We're going to show that this is unambiguously not good. The first thing I want to talk about are social policies, because look, if we're going to value a democratic process, we have to value the ends that democratic process produces. I'd like to ask you, right, like, are the actual policies advocated by the Republican right good policies? Are those things government should be doing? Is the conception of government that this group promotes by actively trying to convince people that that's the right view of government, is that a good one? I think not. When we think about ideal social policy, I think we've given you some kind of coherent view in our side of the House about the way government should work. A view that really hasn't gone addressed by these guys. I think they've tacitly accepted it because they're debating. What we've basically said is, look, like, the proper role of government, first of all, isn't to dictate to people how to conduct their private affairs, insofar as those private affairs have no impact on others, right? We said, look, individuals are most capable, most knowledgeable of what their own life circumstances are. Those are the people who should make decisions for themselves. Now, is it good for an organized, powerful, well-funded political minority to actively oppose good social policies, to actively oppose that kind of view? I think not. When you think about the impacts that the Republican right has had upon individual rights in this country, the rights of homosexuals, insofar as that's a group of people who are actively discriminated against almost solely on the basis of, I think, religious views, like felon rights, people who are non-Christians, all groups of people, I think, who are ultimately harmed by the impact of the Republican right in the democratic process. We think that society should keep religion out of government because that is one of the founding tenets that is in our Constitution, and we think the government shouldn't tell people how best to run their lives and to dictate morality from the structure of government. So insofar as the social policies actively promoted by the Republican right are bad ones, we think that's bad for the end of the democratic process. But the second thing I'd like to talk about is actual democracy itself, right? So what we've shown you is there are all kinds of ways that the Republican right has a disproportionate amount of political influence, especially vis-a-vis the GOP, right? Especially vis-a-vis the Republican Party. And what I'd like to ask as a broad question, is democracy helped or hindered when a small number of people essentially set the political agenda to the detriment of many more people who are disenfranchised, who don't have access to political power, access to wealth, access to the same amount of organization, because those people's views ultimately aren't represented? We said the picking of candidates is highly influenced. Candidates aren't allowed or aren't basically politically motivated to express their actual views. Foreign policy, like the foreign policy agenda, is largely hijacked by this group within the Republican Party. And we'd say is the nature of democratic discourse itself is different. What these guys have hinged their case upon is that discourse itself is good. But what we've said is, when that discourse issues from some kind of religious belief that's immutable, it isn't based on reading New York Times columns, but listening to what your preacher has to tell you, or saying that because this isn't a good book, I can't contradict a view held by religious authorities, that isn't good discourse, that isn't good for the democratic process. Ultimately, more pressing social matters left behind at the point where this small organized minority basically sets the political agenda. And the fact that there are more pressing issues, the fact that lots of people are collectively disenfranchised, the fact that lots of people have nowhere near as amount of political say as this small group isn't good for democracy. We believe in the principle of one man, one vote. Not one crazy right-wing group, lots of votes. The third and final thing I'd like to talk about is the marketplace of ideals. Because what I suspect we're going to hear in the rebuttal from the Prime Minister is essentially just a lot of ranting and rambling and drooling about the marketplace of ideals and how much this guy loves us an awful lot. What I suspect they're going to say is, look, any discourse is good discourse. This is their whole media point. The theory is that the cream rises to the top, right? We're not talking about, essentially, the right to speech, or the freedom of these groups to express views. But I think the reality of the marketplace of ideals is we need to analyze. Like, look, if any individual player, is ultimately their contribution to that marketplace a good one or a bad one? And what these guys need to do is establish why that contribution is in and of itself a valuable one. Because what they're saying is that the best views come out from political discourse, right? I think they need to show you why these are the best views. We wouldn't say like the Nazi Party participating in the marketplace of ideals and like strongly advocating positions would be a good thing in itself, right? Like those are bad people, they advocate bad policies, like they're hate mongers, so therefore they're probably not a good group on balance for American society. The reason we continue to let them have their freedom of speech is because of this notion of marketplace of ideals, because of some semblance of freedom of speech. But it doesn't mean their individual contribution is a good one. And what these guys need to establish is that that individual contribution of the Republican right is a good one. For these reasons, we oppose.
Thank you for your opposition. We call upon the Prime Minister, Evan, to close out the round.
Here, here, here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for recognizing me and everybody for coming out for today's round. PAC gives us 7 points. Phil Randall gives us 7 points. I'm going to race through them pretty quickly because I think they're all fluff. The first one he tells us about is primaries, and he tells us that conservatives have enormous power in primaries. The reason conservatives have enormous power in primaries is because the people that vote for them are extremely motivated to come out to the polls in a way that other people aren't motivated. Political motivation is an important part of a healthy democracy, and if you can motivate people to come out to the polls, you ought to win elections. This is something that doesn't happen in a lot of other communities. Why don't blacks come out to the polls? Because a lot of candidates don't represent interests that don't represent things that interest black Americans, that don't interest African American communities. If people did try to tap that interest, we'd argue that that's a niche that hasn't yet been tapped. Okay, the next thing he tells us is that other more important issues are being put on the back burner so that these issues that apparently the entire country is discussing can be brought to the forefront. Apparently, Phil should get to decide what American voters should think is important. The American voters should get to do that, and the conservative right and the religious right has actually brought a lot of issues to the forefront that otherwise wouldn't be discussed. He tells us about money, and he tells us that there's some bad effects to money, and he tells us that there's some good effects to money. Where's the balance fall? Well, that's the question of this debate. The fourth point that he brings is government should not be based on faith. I ask you why government shouldn't be based on faith. Because he says so. Many people do believe that government should advocate moral positions, that government should pass laws that are, morally motivated and that are religiously motivated, or at least based in some Judeo-Christian framework. I don't see why people shouldn't be able to have this opinion. I don't see why that's necessarily not a good thing for government to be doing. He hasn't told us philosophically why government shouldn't be based on faith, why it should only be based on secular policy and secular beliefs. I don't understand why secular beliefs are necessarily more important than religious beliefs. I think that's a bad assumption from an extremely liberal position. And particularly a liberal position that he assumes all of you hold. The next thing that he tells you is that Supreme Court appointments are being influenced. Okay, Supreme Court appointments are being influenced, but if abortion is illegal, it's only going to be because lawmakers say that abortion is illegal. There's still a democratic process here. The Supreme Court doesn't just get to make abortion illegal. They can say there isn't a protection there anymore, but that's something for Congress to decide, and if you like democracy, maybe it is something that Congress should be deciding instead of the judicial branch. Next thing that we hear about, like American democracy, he hasn't told us why the judicial branch should be deciding this. The next thing he tells us is that there's media influence. I don't see why the media promoting things for one group or people taking, an interest in the media is necessarily bad for democracy. He just asserts things. The last thing he tells us about is there's a subversive role in foreign policy because they advocate something that he disagrees with. I don't understand why everything he disagrees with is subversive. He tells us finally that speech should be equal for everybody, that apparently Max and I should give an equal voice to other people who put a lot of time and energy into advocating their positions, because people who care more shouldn't be talking more. That's stupid. 3 questions I want to ask. First of all, who gets to decide the proper role of government? And what we posit on this side of the house is that the people that get to decide what the proper role of government are the people who are participating in a democracy. That is, you and I should get to determine what our government ought to be doing. I think that there are a lot of people out there who truly and deeply believe that the government should be advocating religious positions and should be advocating moral laws, things that we disagree with because, we're largely a liberal crowd. I think that the Christian right has put a lot of these things on the table, saying that we now need to discuss the moral component of government. It's something that wasn't on the table before. The next question I want to ask is, who decides what people should vote on? That is, why should people vote for certain policies? On their side of the house, they assert that the issues that people should be voting about are the issues that they deem to be important. That is, particular policies that they think are important policies that have lots of harms and lots of benefits. Many people believe that the things that the Christian right has put on the table are extremely important, and I think that by putting them on the table, they've said, you now have the opportunity to decide this. By attacking politicians whose personal behavior they deem to be immoral, they've said the moral behavior of politicians outside their elected office is important and it should be a voting issue. And a lot of people, maybe not us, but a lot of people go to the polls and vote based on that information, because a lot of people determine for themselves that it is an important thing to vote about. Everybody in a democracy has the right to determine what is important in an election to them. And if the moral behavior of politicians outside the office is important to certain people, they should have that information and they should be able to vote on it. The Christian right gives them that information. And they add a layer of transparency to our government, which is why they're good for American democracy. The last thing that I want to ask is what happens when the religious right proposes certain policies that we don't like or opposes policies that we do like? Do they always win? Is abortion illegal? Do we now have teachers leading prayer in school? Do we now have gay rights, being challenged this way and the other way? Mr. Speaker and members of this panel, in the last 50 years, in the last 100 years, we've seen tremendous advancements in the field of civil rights. We've seen tremendous advancements in terms of rights for homosexuals, rights for disadvantaged minorities in the society. A lot of that advancement has occurred in spite of the religious right. A lot of that advancement has occurred only after the development of the Christian right. It's not as if the Christian right has been around advocating these policies forever, Mr. Speaker. What that development has occurred in spite of the Christian right tells you that the Christian right isn't as powerful and demonic as they argue on that side of the house. That advancement can occur within a dialectic where people oppose the kind of advancement that you and I might think is good. I like the ACLU, I spent a summer working for them, and I don't tend to like the Christian right, but on the whole, I think they've been good for American democracy, if not American policy, and for all of those reasons, I'm